Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And last episode, when we were going over some of our favorite games of last year, or some things that we enjoyed, we noticed something that we didn't really talk about, the fact that the 3D collectathon platformer had made a little bit of a comeback.
Yeah, 2017 was a strong year for that genre, and it's funny because like everybody who loves that genre of gaming has complained for a while that those games haven't been around. I mean, since the heyday of Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64 was a while ago. And there have been other games or re-releases, like Conker's Bad Fur Day was re-released on the Xbox in that generation. But there had been quite a bit of absence, and then, you know, lo and behold, the majority of the original team from Banjo-Kazooie made a new game called Yooka-Laylee. We got A Hat in Time, which was another new 3D platformer, brand new IP that was also kickstarted. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the very well-known Super Mario Odyssey, which was a huge hit and a return to form as far as Nintendo and 3D Mario games are concerned. And it was just really interesting for me, and I mentioned this a little bit in the year in review, I believe, but like I went from having no 3D platforms to play, from sinking hundreds of hours into Mario Odyssey and Yooka-Laylee, and now I'm like, I think I need a good JRPG or something. I need a break.
Yeah.
Because a common knowledge of these collectathons is that they're just that there's always MacGuffins to collect of all different kinds. And while you can probably beat the game without collecting all the MacGuffins, if you collect them all, then you get like the true ending. Mm-hmm. And so that can be a little exhausting. But it was cool to see a resurgence, though, especially with two fairly original IPs.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, Mario sort of qualifies as a 3D collectathon in that sense, but they've always, even in Mario 64, Mario Sunshine, they've had a very centralized, you want these things. And
yeah,
you don't need all of these things to win, but don't you want to get all of these things? The Rare and Playtronic games are much more of a, all right, so you can collect these things, but there's also these things, and these things do that, but then this thing, it's a lot of it becomes a collecting pileup of stuff, and
yeah,
so
for sure.
Yeah, Mario is the streamlined version of it, and then the sheer amount is, I guess, what really qualifies the collectathon as a genre, if you want to call it that. I mean, 3D platforming has continued to exist since the PlayStation and 64 era, but I don't know that. Yeah, you're right. The Banjo-Kazooie, the Rare, I guess the Rare 3D platformer is almost what we're talking about here. Like that style, right. that version of the game.
Well, because I think like with Mario 64, it was definitely the originator of the 3D platformer. Like that was the 3D platformer. Mm-hmm. And so everything built off of that. But again, even that, like you had to collect red coins, you had to collect blue coins, you had to collect 100 coins, you had to collect all the stars. Like you didn't have to, but it encouraged you to. And so I think it definitely went in that direction, but it was Rare that made it a genre-defying thing with both Banjo-Kazooies and Conker's Bad Fur Day. And then, of course, Donkey Kong 64. All of those games having tons of things to collect in them and just, you know, really focusing in on this immersive experience as a 3D platformer. And what was great about Yooka-Laylee, which I've played but not beaten yet, although I'm close, is that it's clearly taking that formula and continuing that tradition, but all of the dialogue and all of the characters and all of the narrative is super meta. Like you can tell that these guys were like, we want to kind of put a middle finger to the gaming industry a little bit, and so we're going to use our game to do that and also make it fun. You know, like they break the fourth wall a ton. The person who sells you your moves is a snake named Trouser. Stuff like that. And I'm really digging it, but I do feel like going back to that genre, there are expectations with control in a 3D platformer that if they're even slightly hinky, it can throw you off. Like with Mario 64, not Mario 64, although that also. With Mario Odyssey, I jumped right into it and felt like I'd been playing it for years. Like the controls were super familiar, the Cappy stuff was super intuitive, and while doing the jumping stunts takes practice, for the most part, the basics of the game are really quick to pick up.
Well,
However,
we've had 20 years to perfect these things.
right, and the controls have been fairly similar from 3D game to 3D game with minor changes. Whereas with ukulele, which I'm sure is mimicking for sure the Banjo-Kazooie style, I haven't played that in so long, and the controls were just not as flawless as Mario's Odyssey, which I had played first. And so in the beginning, I was less than impressed with the game only because I was readjusting to the game controls. So that said, once I figured out how to best control myself, how to work the camera, how to use all of the special moves, I realized, oh, the game's fine. I just had an adjustment period. Because in the beginning I was like, oh, these controls suck. I'm not going to be able to play this game. And then after like 2 days, I forgot that I was having trouble with the controls. And so it's interesting to me that even though these games can be similar in style, the controls can really make or break the game.
Oh, very much so. When you think about like how many, because getting a lot of the early stuff is fairly straightforward, but they always hide jiggies, they always hide banana coins, they always hide pagey stuff in out of reach places, bizarre spots that need pinpoint accuracy, and it was incredibly frustrating to do a lot of that on the N64 because everyone was still getting a feel for how 3D controls went. And there was so much animation that would have to happen to adjust yourself into a new spot that you really didn't have like subtle adjustments that you could have. You'd have to sort of barrel through it and know what you were doing. Because as a little bit of history here, I really don't have a deep nostalgic love for 3D collectathons. Not that PlayStation didn't have them. I mean, we had stuff like Croc, Legend of the Gobos, and I mean, Spyro could be considered one as well.
For sure.
Yeah. And because I mean, like, I'm also thinking about what constitutes these things. Because I look at it and I go, well, Crash Bandicoot had you collecting things and you were in a 3D environment, but that had set levels. And it was a singular beginning to end. And that sort of is what defines it. It can't have that. It needs to be more open.
Well, yeah, the 3D platformer, I think, is more generalized and where we're kind of basing the conversation. But for sure, Crash even wasn't always a 3D platformer. There were tons of stages where you were side-scrolling 2D style, even though the graphics were in 3D. And so Crash was kind of bridging the gap. It definitely was one of the most defined 3D action platformers for PlayStation. But it wasn't until the second and third game that you really got a sense of a 3D environment. In the first game, it was usually running back to front or, side to side. And so it was emulating 3D, but it wasn't really quite there yet.
And it was them finding their way in means of controlling.
Sure.
By contrast, I started playing Donkey Kong 64 for the first time last year. And because it's my wife's favorite game. And we had it, and she was like, how could you not have played this? We're playing this. And the controls have frustrated and eluded me for quite a while. I actually ran into this problem when I played Super Mario 64 for the first time in ages. Maybe a year or two ago, and had that realization of like, man, we take a lot of 3D control these days for granted. The amount of like, I just want to do a quick little turn, a little eek thing. Oh no, I need to do like a whole circle to run around here. No, I fell off that platform. A lot of that. DK64, the amount of like weird time stuff that had to happen, the amount of like bonus stuff, the amount of everything else with those sort of tanky controls. I've gotten very frustrated with it, and having played it in an age where the controls and design philosophies have moved past it, it's very, very frustrating. It's kind of like it reminds me of an article I once read about the death of the point and click adventure. And the grand conclusion of it was talking about one of the more esoteric puzzles that had to happen in one of the games. It was a Sierra title. And they just wrote it out and then concluded with, what killed point and click adventure games? Point and click adventure games killed themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think that might have something to do with why we haven't seen significant 3D collectathon games in a good long while. after Rare was bought by Microsoft, and a lot of their IPs couldn't be touched in quite the same way.
Right. Well,
Um,
yeah, and we're completely ignoring a Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which was atrocious. And I never played it, but I've watched enough videos on it to know it was atrocious.
I'd like to try it just so I can actually have a genuine opinion on it.
That's fair.
I don't always like, well, the internet says this, so it's probably true.
No, of course. And like I've speaking of games in 3D spaces and 3D platformers more general, I've loved more than hated Sonic's endeavor into 3D. Now, admittedly, I haven't played Sonic Colors, which is boasted as one of the best modern Sonic games. But I played Sonic Generations, I've played Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, I've played Where Sonic, whatever that one was called, Unleashed.
Sonic Unleashed, yeah.
I've played, what else is there? I haven't played Sonic Forces yet, but Sonic Forces has gotten a general meh from the industry. Like, it's okay if you like Sonic games, but I still want to play it. So to that regard, like, for sure, I agree that generally you should form your own opinions, especially when talking about bad games. But there is one 3D platformer that's held as the worst 3D platformer ever that I've not played that I do want to play just because of how bad it is.
Yeah.
And it's Bubsy 3D.
Right. Yes.
So Bubsy 3D came out by Accolade, who are back in the news because they just put out a new Bubsy game, which, like, that's what that is. It was notoriously, like, the worst game ever made. So this came out for PlayStation after Mario 64. They scrambled to get this out because 3D platformers were becoming a thing, and they wanted to hold on to the IP. And it was like polygons and the no purpose to the game, no quests. You were collecting things, but they didn't seem to really serve a purpose. Like, again, this is a game I've not played, but I've watched many a review on, and I'm interested to play it because of how bad it is. You know how, like, you see trailers for movies and or people talking about how bad a movie is, and it just makes you want to see it more because of how bad it is?
Yeah, curiosity.
It's the same thing with this game, but it's definitely held as one of the worst 3D platformers ever made.
Well, Bubsy in general is just a shining example of why designing marketing first can be disastrous.
Yes.
Because he was utterly designed to be like to have no will of his own, to have no interesting thing of his own. It was just like he's an animal mascot character with tude, not attitude, with tude. And we're going to like lean into that. As though they're side scrollers, fine. Our Bobcat with tude is going to be a side scroller. Oh, it's 3D now? Well, that tude's going to 3D. Like, the games are afterthoughts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it had its own cartoon and all of that. Yeah, and that's a whole other thing we can cover the next time we do cross media and stuff. But but I do want to I don't want this to be a whole episode where we praise 3D platformers because there can be a lot of missteps in making them, and I've played a lot of bad ones as well, or ones that I didn't enjoy. And I'll be honest, like the collectathon versions of 3D platformers, I tend to like a little less, only because I eventually burn out on it. Like I am a completionist to a degree, but I found myself as I've gotten older and wanting to complete and play more games that completing them wholly, unless I can streamline it, I'm less likely to do. And it's what I'm starting to hit towards the end of Ukulele. I'm still loving the game. It's a ton of fun. It's beautifully designed. But I think my problem is I'm at like 85 of 100 pages to beat the game. And I think there's maybe 150 pages in total. And I'm starting to like play in hour spurts because I'm, less into it. And I don't think that's any fault of the game. I think it's just my own preference of playing those games and that I eventually burn out. I mean, the same thing happened with Mario Odyssey. I got a ton of moons, but eventually I was like, I want to beat the game. I want to see the ending, and I want to get to play these other worlds that are locked until you beat the game. Spoilers. But, I think for me, a 3D platformer that's more linear, like your Crash Bandicoot, for example, I tend to enjoy more because it's just beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
or even, when we talk back about 2D platformers, like I tend to like games like Donkey Kong Country because there's a clear path. Like you can collect things on every stage, like the KONG and the balloons and all that. But
Mm-hmm.
for most part, you're just traveling through the game, getting from point A to point B.
And that's a more curated experience.
Right.
And I'm not saying that that's easier to design, but it is certainly easier to design in the correct direction. Any
Yeah.
game that requires backtracking means you have to design it every way around. It needs to be either a challenge or a joy or something, no matter which way you go. And on the one hand, collectathons can do the wonderful thing that a lot of 2D and 3D platformers do and use the mundane collections like your bananas or coins or anything else that like add up to you get a free life with 100 to show you ways you can go or pathways. Because when every way is a path, what is the way to go? And I've heard ukulele kind of does that, but DK64 I feel definitely did a great job of that, except for the fact that they put in too many characters on a system that couldn't handle quick switching between them.
Yeah.
I mean, that is something that I've noticed in my playthrough of Donkey Kong 64 where you come into a new area and they're nice and compact and you see bananas this way, banana coins up there, you see the guy that you get the blueprints from, you see all of the stuff you need to do and they go in all kinds of cool directions, but they're all different colors, meaning different Kongs have to get them, meaning you have to run over here, get this stuff as this one, then go find a switch barrel, jump in there, switch to another Kong, go and do that, switch and go and do that. They made backtracking sections within like corridors basically. And I see what they were trying to do, but it reeks of padding. And again, coming at that, almost 20 years later with with so much more technology and so much more design philosophy having been devised and what have you, it just, yeah, it reeks of padding and it's very frustratingly slow.
Yeah, I will say with ukulele at least that they do acknowledge those things and they let you break the game a little bit. And what I mean is, so the way each world works is you jump into a storybook and you can explore a certain amount of it, and then you need to expand the book, make it larger, and then you can expand more of the world. And it takes a certain amount of pages to do that, to unlock the book and then expand it. And so the world does change, so you are discovering new stuff when you go back to it, which is nice. But also, there are certain moves you get to get through different parts of Capital B's headquarters
Mm-hmm.
that once you have them later game and go back to the earlier worlds,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of breaks the game. Like, you can hover early on and roll early on, and then later on you get an ability for Laylee to just fly and carry you. As long as you have a long energy in your energy bar,
Mm-hmm.
Laylee can fly. And the difficulty is controlling Laylee a little bit. But beyond that, you can fly anywhere. And so once you have that ability, you can go back to the older worlds and kind of just, instead of trudging to the mountaintops by jumping on platforms and stuff, you could just fly straight to the top, and they let you do it, and they let you get pages that way. And I think it's this acknowledgement that, yeah, you've busted your ass to get to this point in the game. Have fun breaking it a little bit. Have fun flying around and going straight to things without having to like trudge through climbing sections and stuff. And so I appreciate that at least. Is some shortcutting that makes it feel like I've earned something, I've achieved something, which is nice. Same with Mario Odyssey in a different way, is once you've gotten far enough in the game, you've learned the controls well enough, you've learned the tricks of where they hide moons,
Mm-hmm.
you can kind of figure out where to look, and it makes finding moons in the early worlds after you beat the game easier because you go, oh, I have all these tricks. Let me see if they work on this world I haven't gone back to in a while.
Yeah, it is fun to kind of do a revisit of all of them,
Yeah.
as well as the fact that, well, one, you've got all of the checkpoint flags that you can teleport to whenever you need to. So if there's one at the top of this big tower and you fall off, well, just teleport back up there if you don't want to do all the platforming again. Saves a few minutes. As well as both having the parrot and the toad that give you hints about moons you haven't found. There's a
Right.
parrot that you talk to them, and they'll name moons that you haven't found yet. And sometimes the name of the moon will tell you where it is or give you an idea of how to find it. So that sets you in the right direction. They'll do that for free, and they won't tell you more than 2 or 3 at a time. And there's a toad that you can pay 50 coins, and they'll mark where a moon is on your map. So where you have 999 moons to collect, there is a way of finding all of them, mostly, without having to resort to looking it up on the internet. And
Which I do appreciate.
yeah, and sometimes you're going to do that anyway. Sometimes you're still just, okay, I know you told me all this. I know this is this, but I still can't find it. I'm looking it up, but that's your choice. Yeah. But it at least cuts down on a lot of those, like, oh, well, how was I going to find that one? Like, that sort of exasperation about hiding these collectibles, these MacGuffins, these, little trinkets.
Well, yeah, I think also what's great about Mario Odyssey is if you have Amiibo, you don't even have to talk to that toad.
True.
You scan your Amiibos, and Mr. Amiibo, or I think it's Uncle Amiibo, he sends those Amiibos out into the world to research where those moons are and then brings the data back to you, which is pretty neat. As someone who's only recently started collecting Amiibos, he'll recognize any of the Mario Amiibos, but otherwise he'll just say, oh, you have a general Amiibo. Let me find you this thing. And, I think there's a limit to how many you can do in one sitting.
I think it's
or
4.
Per day.
Yeah.
And it's per day, I think every couple of hours or 24 hours, whatever it is. And I don't always remember to use it, but it's fun when I do and can do that. I want to shift conversation a little bit to 3D platformers in general and ask you, since it sounds like you were more of a Sony person growing up, did you play, because I only played very limited experience with the Jak and Daxter games, Ratchet and Clank, which are also 3D platformers plus, like they especially Ratchet and Clank was like a 3D platformer shooter thing.
Yes it was.
Talk a little bit about, because I know you do have experience with Ratchet and Clank, how those 3D platformers compared to other ones that were just kind of collectathons.
Well, Ratchet and Clank seemed a lot more objective oriented, I think. And I mean, much like how Yooka-Laylee, you unlock different abilities and that allows you to, go to new things, go to new places. I enjoyed that Ratchet and Clank, it was a little more of a, yes, there was collection going on, but it was a bit more currency based. Much like how in Odyssey, you get enough coins and that will let you get new outfits or by the end of it, more moons. You collect the currency in world and that gets you all sorts of things for your hat ship. Ratchet and Clank was a little more towards the big guns, the armaments, the crazy ideas like that, while maintaining a very good sense of humor. And it definitely, and it's very funny to look at, okay, you got Ratchet and Clank, you got Jak and Daxter, well, it's like Banjo-Kazooie. There was a period of time where you went, well, I guess you need 2 of them to make it work? But it also is like a classic comedy style, where you've got the leader and the sidekick, the comic relief and the straight man, which was very much in Jak and Daxter, where Daxter in the first one, Jak never talked. You just had Daxter commenting on everything, and that one was also. I feel bad. I've played a lot of the first one. I haven't played the second and third yet. Those are series that I waited long enough to get a PS2 that they weren't the freshest games when I started collecting for it, and so I didn't get them the first go around. And then I sold my collections. And so I needed to rebuild, so I made sure to get those games. So there are also games that I'm coming to years after they were made. And I guess certainly with the PS2, that was a generation after the N64, so the analog stick controls were a lot smoother. It's not without its weird little quirks and things like that, but it was a little less breakable.
Right.
Like I've noticed, because I love watching speed runs and tool-assisted speed runs of certainly N64 era games, but PS1 as well, where the weird boundaries of like where the polygons meet or where something goes, people can do some crazy stuff breaking those games. And
yeah, for sure.
People will run into stuff like that casually while trying to collect stuff. And I don't know. And it's actually very interesting to look at the Yeah, the Naughty Dog games and Ratchet and Clank as well because of the difference in tone as well. Because when people think 3D collectathons first, I imagine we go to the N64 era. And
Yeah.
a lot of those games are Saturday morning cartoons. I mean, Conker's Bad Fur Day is the infamous exception. But
Right.
but even that started as Conker's Tales and this adorable little thing, and you can even see that if anyone owns the Game Boy Color game Conker's Pocket Tales, which came
Yeah.
out after Diddy Kong Racing, before Conker's Bad Fur Day, and was indicative of what Conker's game was going to be. Another like cutesy 3D platformer with like endless charm and like no internal logic at all. You look at Ukulele now and go, wow, how obvious. We're collecting pages for bookies with quillies.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, but where do puzzle pieces? What do jiggies matter in Banjo Kazooie? This has never made sense. Um,
Sure.
like in the Sony games, it's a little more of like, all right, we need the power drives, we need this thing to fuel that, we need this currency to buy this. It was a little more internally consistent, a little more conventionally American violent. Not in a blood and guts kind of way, but certainly in a, well, we've certainly got guns. What do they shoot? Coconuts? No. Bullets and energy. I can turn you into weird stuff with this one. And this one's called the Rhino. It's a different tone. So even then, like when we started talking about this, I almost forgot that those are 3D collectathons, and then
Sure.
remembered halfway through, and then you brought them up. So it's and it's a reminder that these things didn't entirely go away. But I think the generation after that, the first person shooter took over in a lot of ways as far as taking on some of those I don't know, points of interest that 3D collectathons had.
Sure. Well, I mean, also think about 3D platformers in general. Let's talk about Naughty Dog, who started with, Crash Bandicoot and those kinds of games.
Yeah, they
And then
certainly made games before that, but this put them on the map.
right. And then evolved into making Uncharted, which, when you think about Uncharted, like it's a 3D platformer for sure, but more modern 3D platformers like your Assassin's Creed, your Uncharted, Infamous, these kinds of games, there's other mechanics. Like you can almost call Uncharted a 3D platformer shooter because half the game you're in over-the-shoulder third-person shooting mode. Same with Infamous, using your electricity powers and all of that stuff. Like there is platforming to it, but when you add powers, guns, and other stuff, it evolves beyond that. And I think the biggest reason the 3D collectathon, specifically within 3D platformers, kind of faded away is because they evolved the collectathon part into other things to make it more modern. I mean, talking about them feeling like Saturday morning cartoons, I think the reason I dived into dove, I suppose, into Ukulele and Mario Odyssey so deeply is because, our modern political climate and social economic climate is so kind of dark and tough to digest at this point that I wanted escapism. And when I'm playing Uncharted, which is a great game, and I love the first two, I haven't finished the third one yet or played the fourth, but the first two were great, but it's also, they're realistic games, and like, I don't want to deal with realism at this point. I want to escape. I want to disappear from the world for a few hours. And that's why Ukulele's been so refreshing, because it's comedic, it's goofy, it's silly, and, self-aware, and it's fun. I think a lot of modern games rely on grittiness, which we could probably do a whole episode on modern grittiness and how sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. But I think for 3D platformers, for me lately, I've wanted the escapism, which is totally me. There's nothing that says about the industry or the games that it's their fault for that. I think it's just a personal taste at this point that I want games that feel like an escape, that are either fanciful or unrealistic or goofy or silly or comedic. I'll go back to those realistic games, but I think I have enough realism in life that I'm just not at the point where I want to engage that way with those kinds of games.
Yeah, and it also games like Mario Odyssey and Ukulele are a bit more objective light. Like you certainly
Yeah.
have worlds you go into. You certainly have things you should do. But it's a little more of the older style where it was kind of here's a big world. Here's some stuff that's bouncing around that maybe you want to collect. Go for it. What do we do? Just go for it.
Yeah.
The Sony games the Naughty Dog games were a little more like, all right, we're doing this to make this happen, and we collect things along the way. Sometimes they unlock new, non-essential but cool things, but it's still, here is what we're trying to do. We have this big overarching story that we keep being reminded of, and we keep having these objectives to head towards. It's not exactly a do this, okay, do this, okay, do this, okay, but it isn't exactly sprawling world. And I think the 3D platformer has taken on a more objective-based design because, again, that is how they will design in the directions they want you to go. They use the things you can collect and the goals at the end of them to lead you in certain directions. They can have branching paths. They can have, come back to this later, and they can certainly have points where eventually you have enough equipment, powers, personnel, whatever you want, whatever the game is, where you can then go back and just, break the original areas. But that's also a sense of satisfaction. And that is also part of the design. I think that's where the 3D collectathon kind of morphed over the past few generations.
Well, yeah, for sure. And then, like, talking about Uncharted specifically, since they've kind of gone from one kind of 3D platformer to another, you know, in the Uncharted games, you're still collecting treasures that don't, like, you can't sell them. They don't serve a purpose other than, hey, I've collected these things. And so there's still an element of their history and the collectathon and collecting things in those games. And a lot of modern games have that. You know, I think where the collectathon lives on is in the achievement culture of having a lot of games still have a MacGuffin to collect, whatever it is. And I think people like, you know, it's that instant gratification. It's that instant reward. Like and this is not a 3D platformer by any means, but I'm playing through Resident Evil 4 for the first time. I got it on Steam. And talking about tank controls, like this game, you know, when you're playing as Leon, you move like a tank. Like it's really, you know, turning is a chore, but it has some of the most precise shooting controls of any game I've ever played. And also, there are certain things that you're just collecting that serve no purpose other than to sell for money to buy more stuff or just to collect as a subquest. And, you know, I feel like that evolution of collecting things in games has kind of overlapped gaming as a whole because people like to get stuff at the end of the day.
Very much so. And we've now reached a point where you can put enough little crafting subsystems or turn-in systems on top of your main game. So it doesn't just have to be, what are all these things for? Well, they're for things. You know, in Breath of the Wild, why am I collecting all of this stuff? Well, some of it is because your weapons break. Some of it is because you can cook with it. Some of it is, what, you don't like bugs?
Right. And also, like, even in Destiny 2, like, you know, the weapons you're getting have, and the armor and stuff, like it serves a purpose. Like you're, you know, upgrading your abilities, increasing your light level, whatever. But like you can get emotes and spaceships, and there's no space battles. Like the ships are just your transition loading screen vehicle when you go from planet to planet. So those are collectibles. Same for the emotes. Like, yes, they're emotes. They serve a purpose of you being able to emote in the game. But realistically, they're just collectibles. Like, look at this cool emote I got. Look, I collected this thing and I can show it off. You know, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think to me, the fine line for collectible and collectathon is, because, I mean, games have, since the dawn, have had ways of, like, unlocking things, getting unlockables, getting cosmetic changes, getting stuff like that. And those are very rewarding, very satisfying. And the Rare era, early Rare, 3D platformers, it was, I mean, yes, in Donkey Kong 64, you would use banana coins to buy new abilities. You would use the blueprints to get golden bananas. And a lot of it all served the purpose of, you know, oh, banana. But they were things you just got along the way that maybe became something else.
Yeah.
And I think you really hit the nail on the head with achievement culture sort of overtaking it. Like, I'm thinking about it, and it feels as though 3D collectathons never entirely went away. they just sort of got absorbed into like they became a thing to tack on to other games. Like that
Yeah.
element, that idea.
Well, yeah, and actually, I wish I had played ukulele when we did our achievements episode because the interesting thing about ukulele, so I'm playing it on the Switch, surprise, surprise, but it's out on pretty much every platform at this
Yeah.
point. What's interesting is you get tonics. You can only equip one tonic at a time that gives you some kind of extra boost, like no falling damage or extra energy or use energy slower or extra health, whatever it is. You
Right, right.
unlock those by doing feats in the game. So on the Switch, there's no achievements. So it's just you do these feats, you get these tonics, and when you talk to the refrigerator woman, don't
Yes.
ask, who gives you the tonics, you can check how to unlock most of them. What's interesting, and I assume is the case on Steam, Xbox, and PlayStation, is that those are also trophies and or achievements. And when you do those, you unlock the tonic, which goes back to our feedback loop of doing an achievement, getting a thing, which seemed to be less common in modern gaming, but it's cool to see arise in the 3D collectathon as a way to modern adapt, getting achievements and them serving a purpose.
Yeah, it's fulfilling one of those number of how much you have / number of how many there are. Don't you want to have those numbers match?
Yeah, right.
Whether that's your achievements or tonics or guns or whatever.
Yeah. It's also it reminds me talking about this is with the 3D collectathon and achievements and getting all of this stuff, it's just kind of almost humorous how a lot of these games handle that. And so I think the reason that I have this tight love of 3D collectathons and 3D platformers in general is because I always felt like in those games, whether they were objective focused or not, that I could kind of almost wrap my own narrative around it. Of course, as it grew, like with your Uncharted's and your Assassin's Creeds, there's still collectathon. I mean, think about the first Assassin's Creed, or maybe it was the second one. You had to collect feathers and flags, and the amount of feathers and flags that were in those games were absurd. But it was this holdover from the collectathon where, it became a feature of a game, not a focus, which I think is really interesting, that shift.
Yeah, you can play the entire game and not worry about this.
But if you wanted
can.
to, well, also, like what I loved about, I think it was the second Assassin's Creed, there were these glitches that you could find in the Animus that when you found them all, unlocked a full motion video of like assassins escaping from imprisonment. And like, it's this quick thing that you barely get to watch. Like you can watch a second at a time. And then when you unlock all of the glitches, you can watch this like 30-second clip of full motion video of these two assassins trying to escape together, which was really cool because it added to the lore of the game. And I think that's the kind of the two universes 3D collectathons will always exist in, especially in 3D platformers, is either they're MacGuffins that just serve the end game, or they're MacGuffins that actually unlock other MacGuffins or other story pieces.
They fill out the experience.
Yeah. And I think it's a fine line between, collect this thing because you should collect it because it's fun, and collect this thing because we're trying to keep you busy. And I think that's what you touched on with Donkey Kong 64 a little bit. And there's definitely a sense of that, is we have all of these characters and all of these things to collect with each individual character, so you'll be busy. And I think there's still a sense of accomplishment and wanting you to engage in the game, but I think it just either intentionally or unintentionally gets overwhelming after a point.
Yeah, and that was certainly a mistake of too many characters for too much stuff. Having the partner-based gameplay was, I think, a good plan. And nowadays, certainly for these sort of collectathons, are more or less a single-player experience, so you typically keep it to a single character. You can have like wildly divergent branching paths, but if you have a central focus of someone to pick them up and not have to like, all right, I got to play this level as this guy. Then I got to play the level as this girl. Then I got to play the level as the dog.
Yeah. It's an interesting mechanic, but that said, like, when they put Mario 64 on the DS, they broke the game up into 4 characters. Like, you actually start the game as Yoshi, who doesn't have anyone's powers, and then you unlock the other characters by rescuing them, and each character can use the different powered hat. Luigi can use the phase hat, Wario can use the metal hat, and Mario can use the flying cap. And then Yoshi can kind of use sort of any of them, like he can become the other characters. So it's a very interesting way of changing that game up and kind of breaking it up, which if you were a purist of Mario 64 was a little frustrating. But otherwise, if you were coming back to this series wanting to play it portable, you wanted a bit of a different experience, and it gave that, which I thought was really interesting.
Well, and that's designing around the portable idea where it is a lot more segmented. You're only going to play in fits and spurts. So you're going to want that.
Yeah. And I think, we could probably wax eloquent on 3D platformers for ages, but I think what's really interesting about the evolution to 3D is just this idea of how platforming and control go hand in hand. And as we discussed before, terrible controls can really ruin a 3D game. And, there's kind of this understood standard now, especially since the N64 generation and now the 2 analog stick generation, of how these games should control. And, I've not really seen anything break outside of that, although I'm sure some have. But, left stick to move, right stick to look around. And having those 2 sticks kind of changed the dimension of gaming as a whole. And I think we could probably do a whole episode on just gaming controls in the future. But the idea that the 3D platformer for sure, and probably the first-person shooter, are the 2 games that really had the most tied to how you control these characters, making the games work well.
Yeah, they bloomed at the time when it was appropriate, as soon as they could, basically. Because there had been attempts at stuff like it in the past, but changes in controls and changes in technology were really what necessitated these genres kind of reaching their potential and then really having big leaps and bounds in designs and ideas. Something like Halo Combat Evolved needed the Xbox, needed 2 joysticks. The N64 used the C buttons to their best extent, but, getting that C stick on the GameCube really opened things up a great deal. And they needed to have these changes in technology. Some genres, you need very little to make it work, to make it look right, to do whatever, but the 3D platformer certainly needed a lot of missteps, a lot of neat ideas that were a little early, a lot of that to kind of be pulled into the greater gaming fold. And I guess that's also why it feels like the 3D collectathon feels a little quaint right now, because it was something that always needed to be sort of like dissolved and absorbed into the greater primordial soup of 3D gaming.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the fact that we can come back to it now is really exciting. Like, I haven't played A Hat in Time yet, but I'm excited to go back to that one, once I've probably taken a break from 3D platformers. But, this idea that it looks like this genre hasn't gone anywhere. And I think at the end of the day is why I'm so thankful for the indie game world, is that these developers can create smaller games that are shorter, but still are fulfilling an experience that we may have missed from our past. We talked endlessly about Shovel Knight, who actually has a cameo in Yooka-Laylee, which is really super fun.
That's right,
It gives you a quest in the first world. But like this idea that we can return to these older games with a newer take, like you've talked about endlessly, and we talked about this in the year in review. Shovel Knight couldn't have existed at the time when Shovel Knight is designed to have existed.
Exactly.
Same with like Cuphead. Like, they needed modern technology to exist, or even games like the South Park games, which graphically aren't that intense, could never have existed on an older generation, even though they are reminiscent of an older style of animation. And I think that's really fascinating. And the 3D collectathons are no different. Like, they couldn't have existed before the PlayStation and N64 era. We just didn't have the power to create that. And, PlayStation showed us that with Bubsy 3D, that it was just the platform was not ready, the developers weren't ready. So
people didn't have the unspoken guidebook of like what works, what doesn't work. Anytime, technology or whatever makes a leap forward and people just try to make the most use of it, it's really... Yeah, it's one of the reasons why the PS1 is one of my favorite consoles, because it was during a time where people were like, okay, we can make 3D graphics. what do we do? There weren't as many rules. And
Yeah.
so some really bizarre experiences came from it. And what's great with the indies now is AAA titles are sort of by design a hyphen fest of genre. Like
Yeah.
every game has to be that and everything. With smaller companies, you can create a, for lack of a better term, purer genre experience. You can make a pure puzzle game, a pure racing game, a pure bullet hell, a pure 3D collectathon. It may be shorter, but it's going to be very much whatever the tenets, I guess, of the genre is, in as long as it can be and made well, which is where I think A Hat in Time is sits very nicely.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just really exciting to see games that are reminiscent of stuff I grew up with. Because while I grew up playing Nintendo and Super Nintendo, like N64 is the first console I remember being excited to get before it came out and like spending all day playing it the day I got it. Like those other consoles I got and I was happy to play them, but my essence as a gamer didn't really come out until the N64, which flagship game redefined 3D gaming. Mario 64, whether you love it or hate it, was the blueprint for every other 3D platformer after it. People changed it up and made it their own, but the idea of a 3D platformer was born with Super Mario 64. And to see how it's grown and evolved and how Sega's done different things with it, how Naughty Dog's done different things with it, how,
Studios
Rare,
big and small, yeah.
exactly. And it's just, there are a lot of genres that can be traced back to specific points in time, but I feel like the 3D platformer for sure has one of the most focused points. Same with like first-person shooter on consoles, at least, looking at GoldenEye. PC players would argue that there were plenty of other games doing that. Of course, your Doom and everything, but it was nothing. There was nothing like GoldenEye when GoldenEye came out.
Right, because the medium matters, and sometimes just because something exists on the PC, it doesn't mean it can work well on consoles. And there are people that spend their entire gaming lives never playing on one or the other, and so it's interesting to see. And yeah, there were probably some 3D platform kind of games before Mario 64, but this is the one that like brought it into the open, and everyone could see it.
And made it super accessible. I mean,
Yes.
It's one of the easiest games to control if you grasp how the N64 controller works, which I still argue is one of the tightest controllers for what it set out to do. Maybe not the most effective, but still I feel like one of the tightest, easy to use.
And context matters a great deal when talking about video game history. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
But I feel like we could ramble on about 3D platformers forever, so I think I'm going to wrap us up here. But of course, as always, dear listener, please let us know what your favorite 3D platformers are. I'm always interested to hear. I feel like especially the collectathon and the 3D platformer in general has so many games I've barely even heard of that are apparently hugely popular, and so I like the diversity of that genre as well. So I'm definitely excited to hear what your favorite 3D platformers are out there. Please hit us up anywhere on the internet. You can find us Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, though we haven't been using that very much. And me and Geoff both have our own personal Tumblrs. I'm DJ Stormageddon. He's Geoff Makes Noise, which is also his Twitter and my Twitter. I'm rambling now, but please find us on the internet and let us share your experience with us. We always enjoy hearing from you guys.
Yes, we would love to interact more and more and hear your memories and hear your opinions and share and grow, in that touchy-feely kind of way. But thanks so much for listening, everybody. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.